Armed with the results of the UN 75 consultation on the future we want, the UN we need, this discussion will focus on how best to take ideas forward at the local, national, and global level.
Our world is facing unprecedented challenges. Climate change is altering natural balance. And our precious wildlife is struggling to survive. We are battling a new era of conflict and violence. There's the disruptive impact from digital technologies and shifting demographics with gaping inequalities. Now, a global epidemic is reshaping our world as we know it. We are at a crossroad at a time when our world seems so divided. Our world is struggling to breathe. For the United Nations 75th anniversary, we set out to ask the world, what are your hopes for your future?
If you could choose one thing to say to the UN, to world leaders about the future, what would that be?
In January 2020, the United Nations launched a global initiative to have the world's largest conversation on the future we want. Discussions have taken place in all settings, from classrooms to boardrooms, parliaments to village halls across the world, in order to reach as many people as possible. The United Nations listened, and the world spoke.
Justice, equality, and freedom for all.
People can really be in peace and with dignity, because our dignity was taken away from us because of our religion and because of who we are. And I hope that we are the last community who are suffering of those problems.
Health is often looked at as an expense. It is not. It is an investment.
We change by exchanging without losing ourselves.
We have run out of excuses and we are running out of time.
If we don't stop the destruction of our natural world, nothing else will matter.
More than ever before, we need solidarity, hope, and the political will to see this crisis through together.
From what we have heard, the world is not as divided as we thought. The global economy, healthcare, sanitation, education, and the hardest places hit are our top priorities from recovering from the pandemic. In response to COVID-19, greater international solidarity is urgently needed. The threat of climate change and destruction of our natural environment is the biggest fear for the future. We need increased efforts to reduce conflict and violence, and we aspire to further protect human rights. For optimism about our future, we need to look to our young people. The overwhelming majority of us believe global cooperation is more vital than ever.
Every time we fail to find solutions to global challenges, the most vulnerable people in our societies are hit the hardest.
Throughout history, we have accomplished unimaginable things, propelling each generation further than the last. There is no limit to the amount of good we can achieve together to make this world, our world, a better place. The challenges before us are universal, and we know that these challenges demand global solutions. We have the blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. The Sustainable Development Goals. In 2045, the United Nations 100th year, let's see the change we have implemented today that will shine a light on our children's tomorrow.
change is coming. The real power belongs to the people.
And I want to turn the question inside out as well. I will not ask, how dare you? Instead, I will ask, do you dare to?
This is the most urgent of times and the most urgent of messages. Now must be our moment for action.
Good morning, and thank you everyone for joining what I know will be an important and exciting discussion about the future the world wants. My name is Elizabeth Cousens. I'm President and CEO of the United Nations Foundation. It's not lost on anyone that 2020 is a year like no other. We had barely begun the decade of delivery to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, when everyone and everything was turned upside down by a global pandemic that every day continues to show us our deepest vulnerabilities as well as our strongest interconnections. Long before COVID-19, the UN set about to make this year, its 75th anniversary year, a year to listen and to learn, to hear from individuals from every walk of life about their priorities, their needs, their fears, their hopes, about the future they want, the UN they need, and about the shape of the world they want to build for their children. We live on a jewel of a planet that gives us life and possibilities, and all 7.5 billion of us are interconnected as never before. So whether it's climate change or global health threats, rising inequality, or stubborn inequities, our generation's ability to solve these greatest of our collective challenges now will shape our future for generations to come. And that's what makes the UN 75 initiative so vital. As you'll hear across these several months of dialogues and surveys, of polling, of data, of just plain listening across 193 countries, a clear and simple truth has emerged. As much as news and social media may at times make us appear divided, we are in fact united. We share a common interest in tackling shared challenges, and we share a common ability to be far more successful in tackling them if we tackle them together. So whether it's a pandemic or climate change or building the new jobs of the future or harnessing technology for good, we need strengthened international cooperation and redoubled determination to work together. And the good news is there's a world of people out there prepared to roll up their sleeves and get down to it. And that spirit of collaboration, that spirit of partnership, that's in the DNA also of the UN Foundation. And working with the United Nations, with all of you and with all of our partners, we are energized and determined about the path ahead. We know the future we want. We know we have it in our ability to seize it. And working together, we're confident that we will. Thank you.
Good day, friends. Thank you for this critical opportunity to be part of the process of strengthening the United Nations' reliance on civil society in solving the challenges of today. As a citizen activist myself, fighting for justice and equality over many years, I know that all parts of society must contribute if we're going to solve the world's toughest problems. I wanted to take this moment to draw attention to two key findings from this global dialogue. First, a key priority expressed in these discussions was a concern to tackle economic inequality and rethink the global economy. This should not be a surprise. The pandemic that is gripping our communities is throwing into sharp relief the long-term structural disparities that are baked into the governance systems of the places we call home. The Open Society Foundations this year has focused its global investments on providing immediate relief for vulnerable workers and communities, with a particular emphasis on collaborating with civic and city leadership while advocating for solutions to structural inequalities. Second, dialogue participants called for the UN to be more inclusive. They identified in particular the need to better include grassroots women, youth, vulnerable groups, cities, and local authorities. This is so very important as we revitalize multilateralism in this time of hyper-nationalism. I'm thrilled that these UN 75 global dialogues are a first step in a deepened practice of civil society engagement by every facet of the UN. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you're dialing in from, and welcome to this SDG Action Zone session. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you also to Elizabeth and Patrick for those inspiring words. My name is Pratik Desai. I'm the Strategic Engagement Lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance, and I'm also the moderator for today's conversation. Our session today is titled Alliances for Action, What the World Wants. And we have an all-star panel with us today who will be sharing their thoughts and insights on the topic, and we'll look forward to hearing from them in just a little bit. But to begin with, I thought it would be important to acknowledge that we're having this conversation at a time when the question of what the world wants has really never been more important. As we saw in the video earlier, we're in a pivotal moment where the challenges confronting us, whether climate change, inequality, shifting demographics, biodiversity loss, and of course, the global pandemic that is COVID-19, have never felt more urgent. And yet, despite these challenges, we've also never before been more equipped as a global community to rise to the occasion and meet this moment in time. 2020, of course, marks 75 years of the founding of the United Nations, but it also marks the beginning of the decade of action for progress on Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs are in many ways our roadmap for a more sustainable, just, and inclusive world that leaves no one behind. They represent our collective hopes, our dreams, our aspirations, and as the recent UN 75 report reveals, they also reveal shared priorities of people everywhere. With data from nearly 1 million respondents from all UN member and observer states, I think it's clear that by and large, we all have the same desires for the future. Those are access to basic services like health, sanitation, education, greater international cooperation and solidarity, more urgent action on climate change and biodiversity loss, greater respect for human rights, prioritization of women and youth, and I think critically, greater inclusivity so that those who are the most vulnerable have more of a say in determining the solutions to the challenges that they face. And on this last point, I think it's important that we keep in mind the opening words of the preamble to the UN Charter signed 75 years ago, we the peoples. So as we spend the next week or so engaging in this sort of new world of virtual diplomacy and debating solutions on how we recover from the pandemic and build back better, let's not forget the voices of all those who participated in that consultation, whether through a dialogue or a survey or polling or through their using their voice on social media. And let's really focus on identifying and implementing concrete solutions that bring together unconventional voices, tell the stories that are too often unheard, and lift up those that are most vulnerable. Our panelists today are all really dynamic and inspirational leaders in their fields who I know are doing just that. So I'm really excited to dig into our conversation. And with that, I'd love to introduce them. First, we have Katherine Zavala, the Director of Grassroots Partnerships with Thousand Currents. Secondly, Otto Saki, Global Program Officer with the Ford Foundation. Third, Giovanna Kuele, the researcher with the Igarape Institute of Brazil. And last but not least, Barry Vrabanovic, the Mayor of Kitchener, Canada. Thank you all so much for being here today. Really appreciate you making the time to participate in this conversation. We have a very tight 45 minutes, so we'll try to keep it moving and make it as dynamic a conversation as possible, but really looking forward to you sharing your insights with us. To start with, let's talk about the UN 75 report and the consultation that fed into it. The consultation was the most ambitious effort by the UN to understand people's hopes and fears for the future. And the results, I think, showed that despite the headlines, despite what it feels like when you go on social media, people across the world of all ages, of all backgrounds, of all walks of life, really kind of want the same things out of life. They're concerned about the same issues. So would love to hear from all of you, what resonated with you when reading the report? What surprised you? Is there anything that you think will have a particular impact? Are those who are in power, do you think that they're going to listen to the results of this report? Would love to hear your sort of reactions. And maybe let's start with Katherine.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. I'm honored to be here. To a large extent, the findings did resonate with me. Through my work at Thousand Currents, which is a global public foundation that follows and supports the work of grassroots groups and social movements around the world, led by indigenous peoples, women, and youth, working with interconnected issues in food sovereignty, economic alternatives, and climate change, We have been hearing the immediate priority to address healthcare and well-being for families and communities, not only through health clinics, but through the access to food, water and sanitation services, traditional medicine, and a need to strengthen local economies. We have also been hearing about the need to address climate change through agroecological practices in food systems, which most small-scale farmers in the Global South practice, and of which half of the peasant farmers are women. The call for global solidarity is extremely important at this moment. We say that solidarity is no longer optional, given that we are living in an unprecedented moment and we are being called to step up with unprecedented response. In terms of surprises, I was intrigued as well as hopeful by the overall optimism of the improvement of women's rights in this consultation. It was a surprise, however, to read that because we have been hearing how violence against women cases in the home sphere has increased due to the confinement mandated by COVID-19 safety measures. In addition, I would have loved to have seen more perspectives from the LGBTQ and gender nonconforming communities. I was also surprised that we didn't hear much about the threat of rising authoritarianism in this survey as a threat to democracy and to the erasures of basic human rights. This context has been targeting specifically natural resource defenders through violence, intimidation, and assassination, and the numbers of these deaths are unfortunately increasing yearly. In terms of the role of the UN, the findings resonate with me, recognizing how essential the UN has been in upholding human rights. And we've seen this through the effectiveness of the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a tool for many Indigenous communities to hold their governments accountable, as well as the promise of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, which was adopted in 2018. Finally, there's still a continued recognition of the UN being essential to tackling global challenges, and the UN 75 Global Consultation, which was conducted at an enormous scale, arrives very timely to give the collective data and research to motivate the UN to take innovative steps for a stronger leadership role.
Great, thank you so much, Katherine. I think really important points that you raised about the need for even greater inclusivity, particularly around LGBT rights and recognizing the rights of Indigenous people as well. So thank you for that. Otto, let's move to you next.
Thanks, Pratik. So what we are seeing is the culmination of work that I think needs to be celebrated that the UN has conducted. It does resonate very much with the work that the Ford Foundation is doing globally. We are concerned about the high levels of inequality, and it's manifesting in the lack of access to basic services, clean potable water, access to health and education. And these are priorities all over the world. So this report is a clarion call that reminds us that these services are not privileges that are being extended to citizens through and by benevolent leaders. No, these are rights, and governments have an obligation to meet these rights for all of us without discriminating on the basis of race or creed. It might be that the governments might choose not to listen, but they don't have a choice because it's a forced choice as the world is currently facing several crises. So the sooner those who are holding public and private power and office listens to these findings, I think the better that it will be for all of us. Naturally, some governments, private sector, public authorities might decide not to listen, but this will be actually, the height of arrogance and denialism, which might galvanize citizens' voices against any form of, establishment. And we might then witness, despite the shrinking political space and civic space, an increase in protests, in voices against continued exclusion, and the denial of fundamental freedoms and rights. So it is an important step that we see has been taken, but there is need to demonstrate commitment from those that hold power and authority.
Great, thank you, Otto. A really important point you made about the need for us to rethink these as fundamental rights rather than privileges, especially given the I think trend we're seeing around shrinking civic space. So really important point. Giovanna, over to you next.
Thank you. So what resonated with me, and I think it is striking from the findings, is that despite the upsurge in populist nationalism and the erosion of the trust in multilateralism, people still believe in the UN and in global corporations. So the findings show that nearly 9 in 10 people believe international cooperation is vital to deal with today's challenges, and 74% see the UN as essential in tackling global challenges. And for me, this means two things. First, there is still a huge appetite out there for multilateral solutions, and people understand that multilateralism is our only option to address global challenges such as the pandemic and climate change. So it's not just nationalist populists who are popular. There are plenty of people who believe in global cooperation. And second, it's also clear, particularly from the UN 75th dialogues and the suggestions from the participants, that people want a different kind of multilateralism, one that is more inclusive. And for that, we need a UN which reflects the diversity of actors of the 21st century, from involving more women, youth, civil society, to listen to local authorities and rural communities. And what surprised me in a positive way is that even with the ongoing COVID crisis and the pandemic as the most urgent threat, in the long and medium terms, it's not future pandemics that worry people the most, it's climate change. The findings show that climate change is the overwhelming medium and long-term concern, and also what people think should be the long-term priority for the UN and global cooperation. However, the findings also show that people are pessimistic because while they want to see improvements, they only see the environment deteriorating further. So I think this can be the basis for the Secretary General to start an even bolder and stronger agenda on climate change.
Thank you so much, Giovanna. Yeah, I think that was interesting to me as well. But I think you also raised a really valuable point about the need for a new type of multilateralism that recognizes all of the actors that may not have had as much of a voice previously. And I think that's a really good segue to Barry, to your perspectives, given your role in Kitchener.
Hi, thanks, Pratik, and thanks for the opportunity to bring the voice of United Cities and local governments to today's discussion. You know, as we look at the report, amidst the current crisis, the immediate priority of most respondents everywhere has been improved access to basic services. And in fact, the report of our constituency to UN 75 has showed how this pandemic has really galvanized how critical our role is in raising public awareness and maintaining the functionality of basic public service provisions while requiring the rapid development of new and adapted services to support things like sanitary measures, all the while ensuring the protection of local public officials who facilitate them. I think now more than ever, it's imperative to guarantee that citizens have equal access to essential resources and services, access to decent employment, capacity building activities, and the promotion of innovation by the development of technological vocations. It's going to be equally critical to take care of our public service providers, those that carry out basic service protection and value their contributions to society. The UN 75 key findings also highlighted that dialogue participants overwhelmingly called for the UN to be more inclusive of the diversity of actors in the 21st century. They've identified in particular the need to better include civil society, women, youth, vulnerable groups, cities and local authorities, business, regional organizations, and other international organizations. This finding has also been echoed throughout the report of our constituency, stating that bringing all stakeholders together is essential to carry out a holistic approach to the emergencies that we're facing and will face. And the set approaches mustn't adversely affect individual and collective rights, which really are the backbones of our democracies. Subsidiarity is necessary for the success of actions at all levels. Dialogue amongst all spheres of government and an effective decentralization must be carried out to ensure that the wants and needs of citizens are present within all government's mechanisms and that they reflect reality on the ground in our municipalities. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. And really interesting, I think, to see that the findings from your own consultation reflected at a local level the same priorities at the global level around the need for inclusivity and more of a say in determining the problems and the solutions, actually. So that's great to see. Speaking of solutions, we're in the SDG Action Zone. This is all about identifying solutions to the biggest challenges we face. So would love to talk about the lessons that all of us can draw from these findings as we think about how we manage and recover from the crises that we currently face, many of which are, of course, being exacerbated by COVID-19. How can we take forward the solutions that have emerged already, whether they're around calls for greater agency and meaningful involvement in decision making? How can we scale them? What are the sort of steps that we can take to ensure that we all are able to lead to a more sustainable and inclusive future? Let's maybe start backwards this time. So Barry, we'll give you the floor.
Sure. Well, thanks so much. And I think, what the last 6 months have shown us, at least in our area, I know it was earlier elsewhere, is that solidarity has become a beacon of security, and it should guide the transformations we need. Local and regional governments have demonstrated our capacity to act as promoters and guardians of this solidarity, both nationally and internationally. UCLG has been fostering this solidarity through the beginning of the pandemic, through our live learning experiences beyond the immediate response to the outbreak that have brought together over 250 local and regional leaders to share the value of basic services in the middle of the pandemic. The Cities for Global Health platform has also been an integral part of this experience. The sentiment of solidarity has also been integral to the development of our UCLG Decalogue for the post-COVID era. That's envisioned 10 recommendations inspired by the lessons shared by our local and regional governments from all over the world. They include guaranteeing public services, financial support packages, proximity models of global consumption and production, a worldwide Green Deal, new citizenship and freedoms for renewed democracy, generation equality, territories that care for their public providers, culture as an antidote for the secondary effects, an interurban system, and next generation multilateralism. More than ever, I think what we've seen is that international cooperation is proving to be essential to respond to the current pandemic, and it's going to prove to be even more essential in the aftermath. It's going to be critical to guarantee exchanges of knowledge and experiences through decentralized cooperation to build back better, stronger, and more inclusive after the pandemic. The shortcomings of our systems that COVID-19 has only but exacerbated call on us to co-create and collaborate between all spheres of government and include all stakeholders and local actors to ensure we build back better, to be back on track with the achievement of the SDGs, and to protect and foster our local democracies.
Thank you, Barry. Really inspiring to hear about what you're doing, and especially the focus on exchanging knowledge and experiences. And I love what you said about solidarity being the beacon of security. That's great. Giovanna, over to you.
So I think the key lesson is that we need global cooperation more than ever, and people across the globe know it. So as already mentioned, people believe international cooperation and in the UN, and both are seen as more important since the pandemic. So this means that the COVID-19 has not only exposed the failures of our international system and clarified that the only way to address them is through global cooperation, but it also has reset our global system and economy, providing us a unique and perhaps the only chance to enhance global cooperation and to change the way people perceive the UN before another catastrophe happens. And this is particularly important because the UN needs not only to show that it hears people, but also that it actively reach out more to the local levels. And the findings of the UN 75th consultation, they indicate that the population at large feels alienated from the work of the UN. And I think civil society can particularly help in this regard, as it does by carrying out the SDGs at the local level. But civil society is often relegated to the sidelines. So I guess to take forward the solutions, we must ensure that the findings and all of the work of the UN 75th office is the beginning, not the end of a process to strengthen the UN. And as already mentioned more than once, the dialogue participants overwhelmingly called for the UN to be more inclusive. And we must ensure that the UN Secretariat carries out a follow-up process that is not only inclusive, but also draws from the solutions that emerge from this report. And particularly, I think civil society has a key role in pressuring the UN and our national leaders to take forward solutions. For example, if climate change is the concern and the priority for people in the long term, we need more than states fulfilling the obligations of the Paris Agreement. The UN needs to invest more in partnerships and consolidate its role as a convener of all levels diplomacy, for instance, to reduce emissions, generating commitments not only from states, but also from the private sector with inputs from civil society. And all this will also help to build the trust we need.
Thank you, Giovanna. Really important points about this being the beginning rather than the end of the process, and keeping that in mind as we continue to engage with communities around the world. Otto, would love to hear your thoughts.
So when we started Pratik, you mentioned the UN Charter that the preamble says "we the people," and I think those are not empty words and an empty opening line. It doesn't say we government, it doesn't say we policymakers, it doesn't say we policy influencers. So the crux of the matter is how to include citizens in these conversations. Citizens are not the enemies. Civil society is not the enemy. So we have to find ways to listen and to act on the demands from the people and not make it a tokenist consultation. And from the Ford Foundation, we have made decisions, our leadership has made decisions that are geared towards investments that really bring to the fore the priorities and the needs of citizens, including challenging climate change, challenging inequality, redressing the imbalances around natural resources allocation that we see, abuse of funds that we see globally. And in addition, they've had to make drastic and radical decisions on how to use market principles to get profits for good. So those are some of the things that we need to see happening. Then second, we cannot ignore the fact that humanity is connected. We've seen that with the pandemic. We continue to see it with climate change. We saw it in 2008 with the global recession. And these are all clear signs that we have to work together. International solidarity, international cooperation, and multilateralism remains essential. We know that there is rising neo-nationalism, from Brexit to Hindu power to America First, but we don't have a solution besides cooperating and working together as a people.
Yeah, no, thank you, Otto. That's great, and I think the call to keep citizens at the heart of this and realize the interconnectedness between all of us is really more critical than ever. And grateful that Ford Foundation actually has been playing a really leading role in reminding us of that importance. So thank you for that. Katherine, over to you next.
As mentioned before, the call for international cooperation, global solidarity comes out very strong in this consultation report. And I believe that part of that call has been made due to a lack of effective and timely government response to address COVID-19 at the local level. When COVID-19 started to hit countries in the global south, it was amazing to witness across regions the emergence of local community solidarity networks or peer-to-peer networks, which help to organize and coordinate local efforts to provide food and medicine access to families who most needed them. We saw communities being innovative at the grassroots level, such as indigenous weavers using their weavings for face masks in Guatemala, organizations coordinating networks between farmers, small businesses, and family consumers in South Africa, or the return to a barter and trade traditional practice in rural areas in India, as cash became scarce or harder to access. I think the findings are calling for international cooperation to be innovative as how the grassroots responses have been, prioritizing the well-being of people and communities first and developing plans for immediate recovery as well as support in the medium and long term. Also, climate change is no longer a concern in the medium or long term, as mentioned in the findings. We can feel it right now as we're seeing multiple hurricanes emerging in the Caribbean Sea and the wildfires destroying homes and communities in the western part of the United States. There's an invitation for the UN to step up on its leadership in addressing climate change and to listen to grassroots solutions, which are solutions that are created and developed by people who are most impacted by climate change. One of those solutions to climate change is the practice of agroecology and food systems by using techniques of biodiversity, native seed keeping, integrated livestock management, and the usage of natural pesticides, which means they're not chemically based. Those will nourish the soil for multiple generations ahead, producing healthy crops for families and communities, as well as helping to cool the planet.
Thank you, Katherine. That's really, really great. I love the examples that you outlined of how the peer-to-peer networks have been activated in dealing with responding to the COVID crisis. And I think a really important point about the need for the UN to also think about how it can learn from grassroots innovation and have more of a sort of bottom-up approach rather than being top-down. So thank you for that. One final question, I think, for all of you as we move towards the end of this very fast-moving segment. The UN 75 consultation asked for respondents the UN 75 consultation asked respondents for proposals for action that could be put forward to the Secretary General of the UN. If you could tell SG Guterres one thing, what would it be? We'll do this sort of rapid fire final word. We'll change it up a bit this time and start with you, Otto.
Well, so Mr. Secretary General, you are the first global citizen. Your actions and statements going forward will considerably influence and determine the world's trajectory. History will record those choices, and future generations will commend you or condemn you.
Powerful, Otto, thank you. Katherine.
As we've been talking about the priority to access healthcare and the concern for climate change, food is a nexus between them. And we know the UN Secretary General is planning to convene in 2021 a food system summit to raise global awareness and land global commitments and actions to transform our food systems. This is a welcoming and incredible moment to do such a summit. And yet there is a concern that the current anointed special envoy for this summit is Ms. Agnes Kalibata of Rwanda, who's the president for the Alliance of Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA, which we know from peasant farmers on the African continent to be a harmful initiative to African agriculture that prioritizes profits of transnational corporations over the livelihoods of African peasant farmers. So as one concrete step to practice inclusion of diversity of actors, I would ask the UN Secretary General to prioritize the presence and guidance of peasant farmers, indigenous peoples, and food sovereignty movements such as La Via Campesina to direct this summit as we understand the UN to be a global entity that listens to people and communities, calling for a collective effort to build a future with improved health, equality, and peace.
Thank you, Katherine. Really important points. Barry, over to you next.
Thanks. Secretary General Guterres, you've been a friend of local governments during your mandate, and the world that we need in 2045 will need to truly consider all of us, all of our communities, and all spheres of government in the governance mechanisms. We're recommending 4 things. 1, that the sacrifices being made will reflect in future generations. Debt and investments need to be coupled with robust plans for a sustainable future. 2, that the SDGs remain now more than ever a valid reference to frame the transformational measures being implemented. 3, that local and regional governments and their associations are aware that the only way forward is via co-creation with our communities and local actors, including the private sector, and with full collaboration between different spheres of government. And 4, that we're convinced that a strong multilateral governance system and a new collaborative governance culture that can guide the steps in such interconnected realities is necessary to present a package of measures for the aftermath. UCLG stands ready to be that voice of local and regional governments at the United Nations and all of its constituent bodies.
Thank you, Barry. Really inspiring, and I love the invitation to work with your networks. And then lastly, Giovanna.
Thank you. So it's clear from the report and what everyone mentioned here that addressing the biggest global challenge we face requires including with the peoples. And civil society has been a crucial bridge between the UN and the people it serves. Hence, I urge the Secretary General to designate a senior official as a focal point for civil society, which will ensure greater coordination and resourcing for efforts across the organization to engage with civil society and to ensure that the UN hears from new, more diverse and representative and otherwise currently less heard voices. If the system becomes more agile, effective, and credible, in a quarter century, the UN will be able to celebrate its centenary.
Great. Thank you so much, Giovanna. And thank you all. That was a really interesting, fascinating, inspiring discussion. I think in that last segment, particularly, a lot of really interesting and action-oriented suggestions for the Secretary General, especially around thinking about the interconnectedness of issues, diversity of actors, thinking about the SDGs as a roadmap for the future. and greater inclusivity and involvement of grassroots movements, including civil society voices, so that we're able to co-create and make sure that the future is one that is inclusive and impactful for everyone. I think that what we've also seen from this conversation, reiterated many times as we saw in the report, is that the world, despite how it may seem right now, is fairly united when it comes to our hopes and our fears and our dreams for the future, and that we have a really unique opportunity ahead of us right now to seize the moment. But it's going to require us to work in new ways, imagine new ways of working together across borders, across sectors, across geographies. And I think as we continue with the 10-year countdown for the SDGs, it's going to be more important than ever that we remember that the SDGs are at their heart about leaving no one behind, making sure that people everywhere are heard and included in decision-making and solution creation. And so if we're able to do that successfully, and we're able to imagine a new social contract that prioritizes inclusivity and ownership at the heart of that agenda, I think we'll have a lot to celebrate in 2030 when the goals expire, and in 2045 when we're at UN 100. So thank you all again so much for sharing your perspectives. Thank you all who are listening for being part of this conversation. We encourage you to read the UN 75 report if you haven't yet, and to think about what this could mean in your own communities to take forward these solutions. And we look forward to seeing you again and continuing the conversation later this week throughout the UN General Assembly, and hopefully in person soon once the pandemic has passed. So thank you all. Take care.
Take care, Pratik.
Thank you.
Thank you.